Now, we've been talking about the fact that the fuse has been lit. We are talking about how the American Revolution is now on its way. It's going to happen no matter what, it seems. So, now let's take a look at some of the specifics, some of the things that were going on at this time that truly helped lead the Americans to revolution. Now, following the Seven Years' War, okay, the French and Indian War, Britain had a huge debt. They had gone far into debt to fight this war. Now, they had in no way, shape, or form an intention to make the Americans pay off all of it for Britain. However, they did feel that the Americans should be paying, like a third of the cost. Redcoats had been used for the protection of Americans. They felt that the American colonists were receiving all the benefits of being British subjects without paying any of the costs. They were getting all this good stuff, but weren't helping to defray the cost. And so, while we did have Prime Minister Pitt go through during the French and Indian War, we're going to have a new one, a gentleman by the name of George Grenville. There he is on the left. Now, he was considered an honest individual. He was considered an able financier, but he was not known for tact. In fact, Paul Johnson, an historian, has said that he was a man who had a tendency to always do the wrong thing. Now, again, this is not one of those things where we're talking about he's doing this out of some sort of malice or bad intent or anything along those lines. He's just making poor decisions, not really trying to be a bad guy. But what he does is he orders that the navigation laws start to be enforced. Now, these have been on the books for years and no one has really cared. Remember, we talked about that. We said even if you got caught smuggling, you were going to be tried by your friends in town who thought you were cool for having been a smuggler. Now, when they start to actually enforce these laws, this is going to keep adding to this resentment level for the American colonists. It's things like, for example, the smuggling laws. Instead of being tried by your friends, now you're going to be tried by a military court in Nova Scotia. Okay, we're not talking about simple changes. This is going to be a massive now enforcement. And the colonists have spent years ignoring these laws, and now they're going to be enforced. Another thing the prime minister did was he secured the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, it increased a duty on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. There's a typo there. I apologize for that. In other words, there's going to be some added taxes placed on sugar that's coming from the British colonies of the West Indies to the British colonies in North America. Now, sugar was a huge important thing at this time. People loved it. People still love sugar today. Look at how much we as a society eat. But at this point in time, you are now going to have to pay an extra essential tax on this. And the Americans really disliked this and they spoke up. They started to complain. The duties were eventually reduced, but the idea had been set that from this point forward, these things might be coming about because, after all, Britain had debts that they had to pay, and the American colonies, they were going to have to help do that. But it wasn't just the Sugar Act that was causing resentment among the colonists. In 1765, they also passed what's known as the Quartering Act. Now, this would require colonies to provide both food and shelter for British troops. Theoretically, the Crown could go through, it could send troops to wherever in the colonies for whatever reason. While the troops are there, it was the responsibility of the colony to provide for their food and shelter. And this was going to be a cost that would really be paid by the colonists themselves. Now, this was so odious, this was such a big problem to the American psyche that after we won our independence and we actually have the Constitution in place, the Third Amendment to the Constitution would forbid this policy except in times of emergency or war, things along those lines. But this was put in place, and this, again, just added to that overall resentment of Britain. Then, also in 1765, he imposed a stamp tax to try and raise money for the new military force. Keep in mind, following the war, there was a huge new area of land that had to be protected, that you needed troops to cover and defend. As a result, there was the need to pay for this. Now, the stamp tax was an idea to raise money from the colonies to pay for the defense of the colonies. The prime minister essentially wanted the colonists to, as the saying goes, have some skin in the game, wanted them to be able to actually help pay for their own defense. Now, the Stamp Act mandated the affixing of a stamp just like this one, certifying that there had been a payment of a tax. Now, the tax itself was not a huge amount. It was a very small amount as far as money goes, but this entire thing was a huge psychological blow, and there was a great deal of resentment over the concept of this particular tax. Now, the stamps were required on bills of sale for about 50 different trade items, plus there were different commercial and legal documents that required it. Things like marriage certificates, playing cards, and dice even had to have this stamp attached to them. And so both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act provided for the offenders to be tried in what are called admiralty courts. Here, the defendants are going to be considered guilty until proven innocent. If you are guilty, or at least arrested, I should say, for a violation of one of these, you're not going to be tried locally. Like I said before, for the smuggling thing, you're going to go before a military court. You're not there for the state to prove you did fill in the blank. You are there to prove that you are innocent of whatever the particular crime is. So again, the American people, the colonists, are getting more and more annoyed with what is going on here. Now, Grenville, he felt that these taxes were fair. His theory was he was simply asking the colonists to pay their share of the deal. Plus, you got to keep in mind, there was a heavier stamp tax going on in England at this point in time. So, in all honesty, the Americans, the colonists, were getting a pretty good deal out of this. But again, the resentment was really over the principle. People were annoyed, they were outraged, they were angry over the fact that this tax was being placed upon them. And they were going to start to take, action against it. While the prime minister may have thought that these taxes were completely fair, completely reasonable, and everything you can think of along those lines, the Americans felt they were being unfairly taxed for an unnecessary army. They didn't see the need for the redcoats to be over in the colonies to quote unquote protect them, because after all, the French army had been defeated. Pontiac's rebellion, his warriors had been defeated, weren't they? And so as a result, was there really a threat necessary for an army to be there? So as a result, this tax started to see some violent reactions. Now, the stamp tax and the stamp collectors really started to feel the heat in things like this. This is, tarring and feathering, where the people who were actually their job it was to collect this particular tax got the very, very special attention of a number of American colonials at this point in time. In fact, this is where we started to hear the cry, no taxation without representation. It wasn't necessarily the fact we were being taxed. We were angry over the fact that we were being taxed without any say in the government. We didn't have the ability for our voice to be heard in Parliament to go through and rule yay or nay on any kind of taxation for the colonies. Americans were angered, mostly to the principle of the matter at hand. Again, it wasn't necessarily the argument that we were not ever going to pay taxes or we shouldn't pay taxes. It's that we were being forced to pay a tax that we had no say on. People were beginning to really look at England as an oppressive foreign regime that was forcing rules upon us against our will. We as Americans, we denied the right of Parliament to tax Americans since there were no Americans seated in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Now, let's be honest. We didn't want that representation. Those who were making this cry, they didn't want to have representation in Parliament, because if we had representation, then we wouldn't have a rallying cry like this. It was going to be a very difficult time for the British dealing with their now a little rebellious colonies. Grenville replied to the idea of no taxation without representation, that we don't have representation, therefore you have no say over us, said it was absurd. He pushed the idea of what was referred to as virtual representation. Now, this is a point in time long before we even began to think about virtual reality, but the same kind of concept. His argument was that every member of parliament collectively represented all the British subjects, be they in England or in a colony somewhere or something like that. And as a result, the Americans were represented. They didn't have the right to complain about the taxation without representation because they were represented in Parliament. The Americans referred to this as hogwash. The virtual representation was not something that the Americans were willing to accept, and they were willing to fight against it.